Good morning. This is Steve Onsman from Calvary United Church of Christ in Reading, Pennsylvania. I'm pastor here. This is my 22nd year, I think. And this is the Wednesday Word for August 26. So glad you're with us. Coming to you from Reading, PA. Calvary is an open and affirming congregation. We welcome all kinds of folks that other churches don't. And we don't care what they think, because that's who we are, followers of Jesus. So today's question comes from my buddy Wayne Cockrell. And here's the question. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, quote, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," unquote. Why would anyone pray to God and Jesus not to lead us into evil? It's a great question. So let me say first a word about the Lord's Prayer. Different versions of it. Different churches have it. If you go to a Catholic church, my wife and I would go, and she'd elbow me when it came to the end, because there's a part where the priest speaks and then you respond. So I never learned that because I was so caught in what I was doing. The partial version of the Lord's Prayer appears in the Bible twice, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So in Matthew, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount. While in Luke, it's a response to the disciples asking Jesus to teach them how to pray. They say, John the Baptist's disciples know how to pray. They get prayers, so why can't we? And so Jesus then teaches them. But the full version of the Lord's Prayer, which originally, of course, included debts, when I was a United Methodist, I used to say trespasses, and now I say debts. That comes from, was first recorded in a thing called the Didache, probably written sometime at the end of the first century, probably around the time of the Gospels, the Luke, Matthew, maybe John, certainly not really earlier than that. It was the full title is The Lord's Teaching through the 12 Apostles to the Nations, or the Gentiles. It's the first known example of a church manual which gives instructions about the sacraments, about how to behave, what to teach. It's the first place we also have anything that's mentioned about abortion, which of course does not appear in the Hebrew or Christian scriptures, but it does appear here. So Wayne's question is in two parts. The second part makes sense, right? To deliver us from evil. That's what we hope faith does, what God does, deliver us from evil. That makes sense. But the question about not being led into temptation. Now, the original language could also mean testing. Don't test us, don't tempt us. Certainly based on the idea that any trials or tests or temptations that we encounter in life ultimately are derived from God. I mean, think about it. Jesus himself was tempted or tested in the wilderness by Satan, who at the time, it seems at least, had not fallen, but was actually working for God, like in Job. You know, if you read Job, you'll see that Satan keeps saying, yeah, Job's not so great. His life is too good. Let me make his life hard. And then, okay, so Satan is a fallen angel, and so that's the issue, right? So here we have the serpent in Genesis 2, for example, is created by God. So ultimately, because of the imperfection of creation, it was never intended to be perfect. God just said it's good, or it's very good. No more praise than that. And so the serpent becomes this metaphor for evil, for the imperfection of creation. So the counter to this idea, however, that God brings evil into our lives or leads us not into temptation or testing or trial, the counter is in the book of James. And if you've never read it, Hebrews and James, we're in the middle of studying Hebrews, and we'll be moving on to James in our Monday night Zoom Bible study. You're welcome to be a part of that. If you want, just contact me, and I'll send you the link. Everybody's welcome to be there. Here's what it says in the first chapter. No one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and God tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then, when that desire has been conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. So if you allow sin to mature in your heart, in your life, in your actions, then that leads you to death. So when considering the Bible, we need to understand that the Gospels were not written as they went along in real time. Right? Nobody was keeping track. Mark was probably 30 to 35 years after the resurrection. Matthew and Luke maybe 50-ish. John 55 to 60. We're not exactly sure. They were handed down through the generations. So consider what that means now. World War II ended 75 years ago. Imagine having nothing in writing all that time, just stories being handed down, and then asking people who fought in it or lived through it or their children or grandchildren to give you an accounting. It would be nearly impossible to get things exactly right. So it is with the Gospels. While we have the gist of what's happening, what Jesus said, it's not necessarily exact because, again, remember, there's no punctuation in the original languages. So all the punctuation is put there by interpretation. And there's other things I'll address in the future. Did Jesus say that we should ask God to not lead us into temptation? Or is that how the grandchildren of the original disciples remembered it? We don't know. And we know that the Lord's Prayer was expanded by the church later on, as I said earlier. So what we have in the two Gospels wasn't enough for them. They changed the Lord's Prayer as well. I like the versions that say things like, keep us from the time of trial, or don't let us yield to temptation. That makes a lot more sense to me. And it promotes the idea that we have free will, kind of like James says, we choose to give in to temptation. We choose to commit sin. It's not God doing it to us or doing it for us or making us move around like we're puppets. As many of you know, central to my theology is the idea of free will, which is, to me, the understanding of, as James says, maturity in faith, mature theology. So, until next week, be safe, wash your hands, wear your mask, keep a good distance, have a great day. Thank you for being here.